Don't worry, Mom. I'll get you out of this.
Are you ready for today? Do you have anything to say?
No comments at this time, please.
Diane Carter had spent 11 years building a life she was proud of, working double shifts as a bookkeeper for a family-owned auto parts company in Maple Ridge, Ohio, raising her daughter alone after her husband walked out before the girl's 3rd birthday. She never missed a school play, never skipped a parent-teacher conference, and never once imagined that a single Tuesday morning would end with her being led out of her own home in handcuffs while her 12-year-old daughter watched from the staircase, too stunned to cry. What Diane didn't know that morning was that the fight to save her would not come from a hired attorney or a courtroom veteran with decades of trial experience. It would come from her own daughter, a 7th grader who had spent the last 2 years quietly absorbing everything she could about the law, without anyone realizing why. 10 months later, on a gray November morning, that same daughter, Emma Carter, walked through the doors of the Franklin County Courthouse wearing a blazer 2 sizes too big, borrowed from a neighbor who used to be a paralegal. She walked past the bailiff, past a row of reporters who had shown up expecting a routine hearing, past attorneys twice her age who barely glanced at her, assuming she was someone's daughter waiting in the hallway. But Emma didn't stop in the hallway. She walked straight to the defense table, pulled out the chair beside her mother's court-appointed attorney, and sat down. For a moment, the entire room simply stared, unsure of what they were witnessing, unsure if this was even allowed. What Emma said in the minutes that followed did not just catch the judge off guard. It caused the prosecutor to stop mid-sentence, caused 2 jurors to lean forward in their seats, and caused Diane Carter, who had barely spoken above a whisper in months, to turn and look at her daughter as though she were seeing her for the very first time. Because what Emma revealed that morning did not just challenge the case against her mother. It quietly unraveled the story everyone in that courtroom believed they already understood, about who had really committed the crime Diane was accused of, and why. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand exactly how a 12-year-old girl ended up sitting at that defense table, we have to go back almost 2 years, to a much quieter version of the Carter family's life, before the accusation, before the arrest, before anyone in Maple Ridge had ever heard the name Diane Carter attached to a crime. Because everything that happened in that courtroom had already been set in motion long before anyone noticed, in small moments that, at the time, seemed to mean nothing at all. Word had not yet spread through Maple Ridge about what really happened inside that courtroom, but 3 questions were already forming in the minds of everyone who had been there that day, questions that would follow the Carter family long after the gavel fell silent. The first was simple, yet nobody could quite answer it with confidence. Why would a 12-year-old girl, someone who should have been worrying about homework and friendships, feel compelled to insert herself into a legal battle meant for trained professionals? The second question cut even deeper, because it exposed a truth that made many in that courtroom uncomfortable. Where was the real attorney Diane Carter was supposed to have, the one meant to protect her, and why had he not been the one seated beside her that morning instead of her own daughter? The third question was the one nobody wanted to say out loud, not the reporters scribbling in their notebooks, not the neighbors whispering outside the courthouse steps, not even the prosecutor who had built his entire case with quiet confidence. What exactly was Diane Carter accused of doing? And why had the truth behind that accusation been buried under months of silence, half-answers, and a family too afraid to speak? For most of the town, Diane had simply been the quiet bookkeeper who kept to herself, the woman who waved from her porch but never lingered long enough for conversation. Almost no one in Maple Ridge had any real understanding of what had been happening inside that modest 2-bedroom house on Chestnut Lane, or how close that family had come to losing everything they had. To understand how a girl barely old enough for middle school ended up defending her own mother in a court of law, you have to go back to a time when none of this seemed possible, back to a home filled with ordinary mornings, packed lunches, and a mother who believed that telling the truth mattered more than anything else in the world. That belief would soon be tested in ways neither of them could have imagined. Diane Carter grew up in a small house just outside Columbus, the second of 4 children raised by a father who worked in a tire factory and a mother who cleaned offices at night to make ends meet. She learned early that nothing in life came without effort, and by the time she reached her 20s, she had built a quiet reputation as someone who could be trusted with responsibility, someone who showed up early and stayed late without ever asking for recognition. When she married and later moved to Maple Ridge, she believed she had finally found the stability she had spent her whole life chasing. That stability did not last. Her husband left when Emma was barely 3 years old, leaving Diane to raise their daughter alone on a bookkeeper's salary, working for a family-owned auto parts company that had been a fixture in town for nearly 40 years. She never complained. She simply adjusted, the way she always had. By the time Emma turned 10, the two of them had settled into a rhythm that felt, to anyone watching from the outside, remarkably ordinary. Diane worked long hours balancing the company's books, reconciling invoices, and managing payroll for a staff of nearly 30 employees, while Emma came home to an empty house most afternoons, learning to fend for herself in small, quiet ways. She would finish her homework at the kitchen table, then wander into the living room and turn on the television, drawn again and again to the same kind of program, courtroom dramas, true crime documentaries, anything that showed people arguing over evidence and fighting for the truth. Her mother assumed it was simply a phase, a passing curiosity, the way children latch onto dinosaurs or space exploration before moving on to something else. She had no idea her daughter was building a foundation that would one day matter more than either of them could have guessed. Emma was not the loudest girl in her class, nor the one who raised her hand first. She was the one who noticed things other people missed, small inconsistencies in a story. A detail that didn't quite add up, a name mentioned once and never again. Her 7th grade teacher, Mr. Delgado, ran the school's mock trial club, and it was there that Emma found something close to a calling. She studied case files pulled from real historical trials, practiced cross-examinations in front of a handful of classmates, and stayed after school memorizing terms most adults couldn't define. Her best friend, a girl named Sophie Rourke, used to tease her gently about it, asking why she'd rather read about hearsay rules than watch anything on her phone like everyone else their age. Emma never had a clear answer. She only knew it felt important, even if she couldn't yet explain why. At the auto parts company where Diane worked, the atmosphere had begun shifting in ways she chose not to dwell on too closely. The company had been passed down through 2 generations of the Voss family, and its current owner, a man named Richard Voss, had recently brought his adult son, Trevor, into the business to help manage finances alongside Diane. Trevor was charming in the way certain people learn to be charming out of necessity rather than nature, quick with a compliment, quicker still to disappear when deadlines approached. Diane trained him patiently over several months, sharing her login credentials so he could shadow her work during a particularly demanding quarter, never once suspecting that trust would later be used against her. She simply believed she was doing her job well, the way she always had. It was a Tuesday morning in October when 2 investigators from the county sheriff's office arrived at the Carter home, holding a folder of financial records that named Diane as the primary suspect in an embezzlement scheme that had drained nearly $90,000 from the company over an 18-month period. Diane stood frozen in her doorway, certain there had been some mistake, certain that once someone simply looked closely at the numbers, this would all be resolved within days. Emma stood halfway down the staircase, gripping the railing, listening to words she didn't fully understand, yet somehow knew were catastrophic. Within hours, Diane was formally charged, released on bail only after the family sold what little savings they had, and the quiet life the two of them had built together began quietly falling apart. In the weeks that followed, Diane tried to explain the situation to Emma using language gentle enough for a child to hold onto without breaking. She told her daughter that sometimes good people get blamed for things they didn't do, that the truth doesn't always come out right away, and that no matter what happened in that courtroom, Emma needed to know her mother had never taken a single dollar that wasn't hers. Emma believed her without hesitation. But belief alone would not be enough to save Diane from a criminal justice system that moves slowly, unevenly, and often without mercy toward families who cannot afford the kind of defense that wealthier defendants take for granted. The public defender initially assigned to Diane's case, a heavily overworked attorney named Gary Hallbrook, who was juggling nearly 90 open cases at once, met with Diane for less than 20 minutes before her arraignment. He seemed sympathetic, but exhausted, the kind of exhaustion that comes from years of doing an impossible job with impossible resources. Then, 3 weeks before the trial date, Hallbrook was abruptly removed from the case after it was revealed he had a prior, undisclosed connection to a witness on the prosecution's list, a conflict of interest that threw the entire defense into chaos. The county scrambled to assign a replacement, but with the trial date already set and the court calendar backed up for months, Diane found herself facing the very real possibility of standing before a jury with almost no one prepared to speak on her behalf. It was during this period of crisis that Emma made a decision that would eventually change the outcome of the entire case. She had been quietly following the details of her mother's file for months, reading through discovery documents that Diane, in moments of exhaustion, had left scattered across the kitchen table. What Emma noticed, buried inside pages of transaction logs and payroll records, was a pattern that seemed to repeat itself in a way that felt deliberate rather than accidental. Certain withdrawals had been logged under Diane's employee identification number, yet the timestamps on several of those transactions placed them during hours when Diane herself had been documented elsewhere, at a dentist appointment, at a school pickup, at moments that could be verified through entirely separate records. Rather than keep this discovery to herself, Emma brought it to Walter Higgins, a retired attorney who lived 2 houses down from the Carters and had spent 30 years practicing corporate law before retiring early to care for his ailing wife. Walter had always been kind to Emma, occasionally answering her questions about legal terminology when she knocked on his door after school. When she showed him what she had found, laid out across his dining room table with color-coded sticky notes and a hand-drawn timeline, Walter sat in stunned silence for several minutes before agreeing to formally step in as Diane's replacement counsel, on the condition that Emma continue helping him organize the mountain of evidence the case now demanded. He would be the licensed voice in that courtroom. But increasingly, the mind behind the strategy belonged to a 12-year-old girl. Over the following months, Emma and Walter worked through the evidence together most evenings after school, cross-referencing bank statements, security logs, and internal company emails that had been included in discovery. Twice, their progress nearly collapsed entirely. A key witness who had initially agreed to testify about irregularities in Trevor Voss's spending suddenly recanted her statement after receiving a phone call from someone at the company, later refusing to return further calls. Then, weeks before trial, an external hard drive containing duplicate financial records mysteriously went missing from the courthouse evidence room, a loss the prosecution dismissed as clerical error. At one point, prosecutors offered Diane a plea deal that would have reduced her potential sentence significantly in exchange for admitting partial guilt, an offer that, in her exhaustion and fear for Emma's future, she seriously considered accepting. It was Emma who convinced her mother not to take the deal, sitting across from her at their kitchen table one night with a stack of printed timelines in front of her. She told Diane that if she confessed to something she hadn't done, it wouldn't just follow her for the rest of her life. It would follow Emma too, every time someone looked her up, every time her name came up in conversation. Diane listened to her daughter. This child who had somehow grown steadier than she felt, and found herself agreeing to keep fighting. 2 weeks later, working late one evening at Walter's dining room table, Emma finally found the detail that would break the entire case wide open. A single digital timestamp embedded in a login record that placed someone else at Diane's workstation on the exact night the largest fraudulent transfer had occurred. On the morning of the trial, the courtroom filled quickly, drawing not only Diane's coworkers and a handful of reporters covering local crime, but curious residents who had heard rumors that something unusual was about to unfold. Walter Higgins stood to deliver the defense's opening remarks, calm and measured, laying the groundwork for what was to come. Then, with the judge's cautious permission, granted only after Walter explained Emma's direct role in uncovering the case's central evidence. Emma was allowed to sit beside him at the defense table and assist directly as they walked the jury through the timeline she had built. It was this same moment reporters would later describe in their coverage as the instant the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Piece by piece, Emma and Walter presented the login records, the mismatched timestamps, and a newly subpoenaed set of security camera logs from the building's back entrance, footage that placed Trevor Voss at his father's office on nights he had claimed to be traveling. The prosecutor, visibly caught off guard, attempted to challenge the authenticity of the digital records, but Walter had anticipated the objection and produced a certified forensic analysis confirming the data had not been altered. Slowly, the room's attention shifted away from Diane and toward Trevor, who sat several rows back beside his father, his expression tightening with every new document entered into evidence. By the time the defense rested, few people in that courtroom still believed Diane Carter was the person responsible for the missing money. The following afternoon, after a recess that stretched far longer than anyone anticipated, the jury returned with a verdict of not guilty on every count. Diane sat perfectly still for a moment, as though she needed time to fully absorb what she had just heard, before turning to wrap her arms around her daughter, both of them crying in a way that had nothing to do with fear anymore. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered on the steps, but Diane declined most of their questions, choosing instead to simply hold Emma's hand as they walked to Walter's car in silence. It would take weeks before either of them could speak about that day without their voices breaking. What followed in the months after the trial revealed something far larger than anyone in Maple Ridge had initially understood. As investigators began reviewing Trevor Voss's financial history more closely, they uncovered evidence suggesting this was not the first time he had manipulated company records to cover personal debts, nor the first employee whose credentials had been quietly used without their knowledge. Two former employees, both of whom had left the company years earlier under circumstances no one had fully questioned at the time, came forward once news of the case spread, describing financial discrepancies eerily similar to what Diane had experienced. What began as one family's fight to clear a mother's name slowly widened into a broader investigation into how easily a trusted employee could be quietly framed within a system that rarely looked past the most convenient explanation. Diane eventually returned to work, though not at the auto parts company, choosing instead a smaller accounting firm across town, where she could rebuild her professional reputation without the weight of what had happened following her through every conversation. Emma, for her part, never fully returned to being just an ordinary seventh grader, not because anyone forced that identity onto her, but because she had glimpsed something in herself during those months that she couldn't simply set aside. She began volunteering after school with Walter, helping him organize files for other clients who couldn't afford proper representation, and started speaking, hesitantly at first, about wanting to study law once she was old enough. Walter often told neighbors that in 30 years of practicing, he had never seen instincts like hers, and that whatever she chose to do with her life, the legal profession would eventually notice. Looking back on everything that happened to the Carter family that year, it becomes difficult to separate the story of a wrongly accused mother from the story of a daughter who refused to accept an outcome she believed was unjust. Diane Carter did not lose her case because the system failed to notice the truth. She very nearly lost it because the system, overwhelmed and underfunded, simply didn't have the time to look closely enough, until a 12-year-old girl decided to look for it herself. Whether you view what Emma did as extraordinary or simply as an act of love pushed to its outer limit, one question remains worth sitting with long after this story ends: whether justice in that courtroom was served because the system ultimately worked the way it was designed to, or because one child refused to let it fail the person she loved most. If this story stayed with you, we'd love to know what you would have done in Diane's position, whether you would have trusted the system to work itself out, or fought as hard as Emma did to uncover the truth yourself. And if you found yourself invested in this one, wait until you hear the story we're covering next, a case even seasoned investigators struggled to fully explain. Subscribe now so you never miss one of these stories when it goes live.